Thank you very much, Hassan. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So thank you all for having me talk about this topic. As you know, obviously the topic is Salafism and Traditionalism. This is a book I've spent several years writing, and I'm going to try to condense all of this in the few minutes that we have. Obviously, I will not be able to cover every single detail, but those can be found in the book itself. So Salafism and Traditionalism, Scholarly Authority in Modern Islam, is a book about these two trends within the modern Muslim world that both view themselves as the authentic understanding of Islam. So both Salafis and traditionalists, which I will define shortly, both see themselves as the authentic and correct understanding of Islam. What actually piqued my interest in this topic to begin with is that when one looks at any modern Muslim community, or if you look on online forums or social media, you constantly see this tension between people who want to follow scripture directly, whether it's Quran, Hadith, and people to insist that Islam must be understood through a madhab. So in this regard, there are certain questions that this debate kind of revolves around, and I kind of summarize them into three main questions. Actually, it's ultimately one main question, and the next two are kind of sub questions. The main question is, how does one understand scripture? How do average Muslims, how are they to understand the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And the second question that comes up is, what is the role of the ulama, or the scholars, in interpreting religious texts? Do scholars play a role, and if so, what are the limitations of the role of the scholars? And this leads to the third question: when you have a scholarly opinion, a ijtihad that appears to go against a hadith or a ayah of the Quran, what is the correct, quote unquote, correct position? Now, I don't really seek to answer what's the correct position, but I try to highlight the tensions that happen around these questions more than answer the questions directly. Now, the book is called Salafism and Traditionalism, and I'm going to define Salafism and Traditionalism in just a moment. But actually, the book is really a case study of two groups within this, right? So we have different kind of Salafis, and the main person I focus on in this book is a scholar by the name of Muhammad Nasiruddin al-Albani, rahimahullah, and his critics. I'm going to talk about Albani shortly, but there was a lot of, essentially in the late 1900s, there was a lot of debate back and forth between Sheikh Albani and many of his critics. So we find a lot of books, maybe close to 100 books written by Albani against his critics, or his critics writing back against him. And all of this debate kind of centered around these main questions. So what is traditionalism? Some people call them neo-traditionalists. In my book, what a traditionalist is, the way I define a traditionalist, is someone who believes that Islam must be understood through the madhabs, or they believe that scholarly tradition is necessary in order to understand Islam. So one cannot just, for example, bypass scholarly tradition, bypass the turath, and go directly to scripture itself. So traditionalists kind of go against this, and they believe in taqlid. Now, the traditionalists also believe that Islam must be understood through this methodology, right? So when we say following a madhab, it doesn't necessarily mean following an opinion that was established, let's just say 1,000 years ago. It means following a very similar methodology to that's within that madhab. And this can be built upon. So new opinions, new issues arise in the modern world. They would still use that same methodology to build on this tradition. When we say the word tradition, a lot of times what comes to mind is a rejection of modernity, a rejection of the modern world. And actually, traditionalism doesn't necessarily mean rejection of the modern world, because from the traditionalist perspective, tradition is constantly being built upon. So I give an example in the book and in one of my articles. If we look at the works of Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, rahimahullah, who I'm going to also mention later, he actually wrote about 73 books. And of these 73, 55 of them, which is about 75% of his books, are actually commentaries on previous scholarship. And what's interesting is a lot of times he would comment on a very short book that's just a few pages, and his commentary comes out to almost, let's just say 300 or 400 pages. And he was actually asked this question, like, why do you even bother commenting on a small book with so much when you can just write your own book? And the answer he gives is actually very interesting, and it kind of helps us understand the attitude of traditionalists towards knowledge and scholarship. He says, building on the foundations of the fathers, or building on the houses that the fathers built, is 100 times better than just building new houses, essentially. And this is very important when we kind of understand what traditionalism is. The next group is Salafism, right? These are the two groups that we discuss here. And before I kind of go through the different groups of Salafism, I need to distinguish between modern Salafism and historical Salafism. The Salafiyya in the past, or Salafism in history, has usually been, or primarily been, an aqidah, a creed. This creed is essentially one that does not interpret God's names and attributes, right? So if God has a hand, it's a hand. There's no interpretation, obviously, in contrast to the Ash'ari school of thought. So historically, there was a lot of scholars who were Salafi in creed, but they were still traditionalists in law. So for example, they would still follow a madhab. And we have examples like this, like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, and others. And we have here the creed, but the approach towards law was still through the scholarly tradition, right? They were still engaging with the tradition, believing it's very important. In modern times, I believe that Sheikh Nasiruddin Albani, rahimahullah, was one of the most important people in transforming Salafism from only a creed into an entire movement. So he helped make Salafism into an entire way of life, a manhaj, if you want to call it, where it's an approach to law, it is a way of dress, it is an attitude towards politics, it is all of these things together. Whereas before that, it was really just a creed. So what is this modern Salafism that I'm speaking about? Essentially, they share certain characteristics among modern Salafis. One is a textualist approach to Islamic law, and a general rejection of taqlid and what they would consider bid'ah. Okay, now there are different kinds of Salafis. I focus in my book only on pure Salafis, but before that, I just want to highlight these groups here. So the book, again, is not a generalization of all of Salafism, but it's really a focus on pure Salafism, which is the thought of Muhammad Nasiruddin Albani. People in academic works, they tend to call modernists like Muhammad Hamdeh and Rashid Rida and Jamaluddin al-Afghani, they tend to refer to them as Salafis. And actually, this is incorrect. They're more modernist than Salafis. When the average Muslim today, when they think of the word Salafi, this is not the type of person who comes to mind, because these scholars, they sought to interpret Islam through the lens of modernity and westernization, rather than necessarily, they weren't very textualist in their approach. The second group of Salafis that academics tend to focus on are what we would call jihadi Salafis. And there's some problems with this, because if one looks at academic literature on Salafism, there's a lot of focus on politics, Salafis and politics, whether they are jihadi or apolitical. And overemphasizing the political aspect of Salafism is problematic, because what makes one a Salafi is not their political inclination. So Salafism is not a political inclination. So whether one is a jihadi or apolitical does not make them Salafi or not. So in this regard, when people say jihadi Salafis, yes, they are Salafis performing jihad, but their jihad isn't stemming from the Salafi belief. It's usually stemming from some kind of political situation. The third group, we have Saudi Salafis, or what we can call Wahhabis. Some people call them Wahhabis. And actually, this is not the type of person I am, or this is not the group I discuss in the book. Because Wahhabis are primarily Salafi in Aqidah. As I mentioned, they're similar to historical Salafis. But if we look at their approach to law and Islamic text, it's still very traditionalist in the sense that they are Hanbali. And actually, some of the main critics I discuss in my book are from this group. Ismail Ansari, who is a Hanbali, He's one of Albani's main critics, and he can fall into this group. If we look at, for example, Sheikh bin Baz and Uthaymeen, we find that they are Hanbali. Sometimes they say, like rhetorically, that if there's a hadith or there's an ayah that takes precedence over the madhab. Well, if you actually study their legal works, they're always sticking to the Hanbali madhab. So the focus of this group is what I call purist Salafis. Okay, in this group of Salafis, the most important leader of this group is Sheikh Muhammad Nasir ad-Din Albani, rahimahullah, who died in 1999. Sheikh Albani is an extremely influential figure in Salafi circles. If one were to go to any Salafi website, you're going to find Sheikh Albani quoted over and over again. His hadith scholarship is vast and has impacted almost every hadith work today, where you'll constantly see Sahahahu al-Albani, Albani authenticated this hadith, or Da'afahu al-Albani, or Albani weakened this hadith. So he had a great impact in this field. At the same time, he was very controversial. His personality was quite staunch, and even his students noted this, where unlike other Salafis, for example, who let's give the example of Sheikh bin Baz, for example, who may have said in some circles that you should follow the hadith or something, but he didn't really go out and propagate this like Sheikh Albani. Sheikh Albani was insisting that people follow this particular way of Salafism. So Sheikh Albani was born in Albania, that's why he's called Al-Albani, and he migrated to Syria at the age of 9. When he came to Syria, there was actually already an Albanian community there, and this Albanian community was primarily Hanafi. We're talking about 1920. This is pretty close to the fall of the Ottoman Khilafah. And what happens when the Khilafah falls is that there's a lot of people who don't know what to do. There's always been a Khilafah, and now they don't know what to do. And there becomes this strict tamassuk, or holding on to the madhab, or the Hanafi madhab, in this particular part of the world. His father was actually the leading Hanafi jurist among the Albanians, and Albani he started to clash with his father on legal, on Islamic law and other issues. So Albani, he was actually a very, again, his personality was such that he was arguing and debating with people, and he attracted a lot of critics throughout the Muslim world. And that's kind of how I came about to write my book, because there's just so much literature out there against him, and he's writing in his own defense. And I kind of try to take these two sides and document and show the reader why and how these two people are debating. Sheikh Albani, rahimahullah, he was a very avid reader. So when he was young, he actually was reading all kinds of books, novels, mystery, all these different kind of novels that were not necessarily Islamic literature. And as you see here in the picture, he's surrounded by books. He actually was never really taught formally. He never kind of studied in a madrasa or with ulama. He did study with his father, some Hanafi fiqh. He did study with some of his father's friends, but he himself says that he is self-taught. He himself says that he does not have this, traditional, formal way of learning. And his critics, his detractors, this is a point where they attack him, and they kind of say, well, he's not really a scholar. He is just a self-taught person, and they try to take away from his scholarship. And this is somewhat problematic, because if one were to just look at the works of Sheikh Albani, rahimahullah, one will see that he has encyclopedic knowledge of ahadith. Yes, he would have made mistakes. He would have, just like everyone else, he would have had errors in his books and whatnot, but one cannot deny his scholarship. One can disagree with the method of learning that he has, but the fact that he's able to sift through thousands of ahadith and manuscripts and the books he's actually reading a lot of times in these libraries are actually manuscripts that are not easy to access. They're not like printed in nice clear print or anything like that. They're actually old manuscripts, and he's reading through them, editing them. So his scholarship is very it's well established, even though some of his critics will attack him for this point. So the book is divided into 3 parts. The first part I divide into history. I try to give some historical background into this debate. The second part is Islamic law, and the third part I focus on hadith. So I'll begin by going over some brief history. Before modern times, I want to just go back to the role of the ulama in the pre-modern world. It's somewhat challenging for people to think of a world different than the one we live in. But if we go back and try to think of a time where there's no email, there's no television, there's no telephone, there's no print, so you can't just, people don't have easy access to books. If you had a question, for example, about Islam, usually you were required to go to a scholar. And the community would guide you to someone who was known as the scholar in the community, or the the scholar in the area. So the ulama, they were actually the spokespeople for Islam. If there was an issue about Islam, they would be there, and they would have the primary voice in Islam about what Islam says. They also had a monopoly over religious education and authority. So again, if one wanted to learn Islam, there were no books readily available to everyone. One needed to go to a scholar and learn from them, right? And that would require some human interaction. Unlike the modern world, for example, where you can easily learn all by yourself, completely isolated from all human beings. You can learn from a computer, you can learn from books, you can learn from anything like that. And that's kind of what Sheikh Albani did, right? He just learned directly from books. The ulama were also, they usually held high positions. So in Islamic history, usually studying Islam led to a well-paying career. So you would be a judge, a lawyer, you'd be in charge of the marketplace, you'd hold some prestigious religious educational position. And all of this changed in the modern world for what I argue are three main reasons. The first one is colonization. So just think, you are a young person in the Muslim world, you are studying to become a religious scholar, and you are going to become eventually a lawyer in the Muslim government that exists in the Khilafah. And once the Khilafah is gone, now the Islamic law is replaced with secular law. So they don't need ulama anymore. They are using now, instead of Islamic law, they are using British law or a French law or any other thing that's basically replaced. So the role of the ulama was reduced to being imams of masjids, right? And obviously, when there's no well-paying career, people go into other fields. So even now, they usually in this past few decades, we have this concept in the Arab and Muslim world that they say usually the one who goes to the Sharia college is the one who did not get into any other college, right? So because people want a well-paying career, no one wants to go study 8 years to simply be an imam of a masjid in the Arab world where there's really, or in any part of the world where there's really not much well-paying careers or anything like that. So what ends up happening is the intellectuals, the smart students, those who do well, they go on to become doctors, engineers, and their peers, who they remember from high school, who didn't get into any schools, they go into the Sharia college. And these people come out, and the smart student who went on to become a doctor, he comes to the masjid to pray Jum'ah, and he sees that person who failed everything, he's on the minbar and he's speaking. So now there's this issue, right? There's this tension that this person is not educated. And these people who are not educated, they may say incorrect things, and they tarnish the image of the ulama. So a lot of people, the field kind of went, the prestige of the field went away. The second and third issue, which I'm going to discuss in the next slides, is the shift in educational methods and the printing press and new media. So what makes, in the traditionalist perspective, right, what makes knowledge authentic? What makes somebody an alim, someone who can speak about Islam from the traditionalist perspective? Traditionalists, at least in theory, this still happens. This kind of education still takes place in many parts of the Muslim world. And now we have places like Azhar, not necessarily, but around it, you'll have a lot of kinds of education like this, where there's this teacher-student relationship, right? Where when you study with a sheikh, you study with a teacher, and it's highly didactic. What that means is you're not just given a textbook to read, go home and come back and take a test, right? You're reading line by line. A student would recite the textbook out loud. The sheikh would pause the student to make sure he's reading correctly or correct a pronunciation. The teacher would this by the author book and the author, the legal and dogmatic implications of certain words are all highlighted in this teacher student method of learning. So it's a very active form of learning. And what actually happens here in this process of learning, the teacher gets to know the student quite well. And once the student completes the book, the student would give, the teacher would give the student an ijazah. Now, in ijazah, when I say ijazah in my book, I'm really referring to a legitimate ijazah, not the one that just passed out. You know, sometimes there are circles where one person's on a microphone and there's like hundreds of people there and he'll just say a hadith and he'll give them an ijazah and a hadith. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to this very close teacher-student relationship. And actually, traditionalists, they model this teacher-student relationship based on actually the companions and the Prophet ﷺ. So they say, for example, the Sahaba are called the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. And they would call the student the Suhba, for example, of Imam Abu Hanifa, wa Suhba. So it's kind of ultimately a peer review. It's a kind of just making sure that this person understands this text properly. And traditionalists, they kind of say, well, this method of understanding Islam or learning Islam is very important because it prevents extremism or tatarruf. There are many people who were unhappy with this method of learning. And here we have one of them is Emad Hamdeh, the Egyptian scholar who died in 1905. He was at the forefront of changing this method. So he believed that the ulama of the present didn't hold the answers about how to be both modern and Muslim. So he was looking at these fiqh books and he was considering them very outdated. They didn't address the problems of the modern Muslim world. He was quite frustrated with it. He felt that these students of knowledge are just studying these books and they're completely out of touch. The West is doing all of these amazing technological advancements, and you have these students of ulama who are studying a fiqh issue that has nothing to do with the modern world. So he was quite frustrated with this. So he really pushed for a curriculum change in the Arab world, and he pushed for the introduction of the university system, where when you learn Islam, it was instead of that teacher-student relationship, it was more of like, okay, there's a professor and we have a class of students and they come and they learn. And what that does is it kind of dumbed down, if I can use that term, the standards of scholarship from the traditionalist perspective. And even Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, rahimahullah, he actually complains about this. And he says that sometimes you have a student who goes to the university and he studies hadith. And let's just say in 4 years, he studies, let's just say 400 hadith. Throughout every semester, let's just say he takes so many hadith, and he graduates and he studied, let's just say 400 hadith. And he comes out and he says, I am a muhaddith. And from the traditionalist perspective, this title of muhaddith is very lofty. And someone who and Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda actually says that this person may have come to class and just barely passed, right? And he maybe have been sleeping sometimes in class and he's not a good student. But there's no ijazah that's given. It's simply a test, and the student maybe is good at test taking, maybe he memorizes a few things, but simply leaving with memorizing 300 or 400 hadith does not make one, in the opinion of the traditionalists, a muhaddith. So there's this curriculum change, and there is this understanding that in order to change Islamic education, we must adopt Western standards, and that's what Emad Hamdeh was one of the people who pushed towards it. There was also a curriculum change where the main texts in the Muslim world that were studied earlier, instead of studying the direct text, for example, of Imam al-Shafi'i, we have people studying now textbooks, which is quite different because they're studying like the understanding of a modern person instead of going directly to that. So the third point that brings in this context of what we are looking at is the new media, right, and printing press. So we have now access to information. And as you saw, Sheikh Albani was self-taught. Had it not been for the availability of books, Sheikh Albani would not have been able to read all of these books. He would have been required to go and access them through a scholar. And actually, Sheikh Ali Tantawi from Egypt, he actually has this very interesting saying. He says, لولا الزهير ما كان الألباني. had it not been for Zuhair al-Shawish, who was he was the head of al-Maktab al-Islami, where Albani, which published most of Albani's books and distributed them to the Muslim world. He said, had it not been for Zuhair, meaning Zuhair printing and distributing Albani's books, Albani would have never been who he was. This is obviously a debatable point because Albani's scholarship was, as I mentioned, quite vast. But the idea is that with the help of print, this people now in the Muslim world are participating in knowledge. Even today, the internet, and you have social media and everything, the number of people participating in religious education is vast compared to historically. So historically, if one wanted to learn, again, they had to go to a scholar. If one had an opinion, they would share it with the people in their village or in their city, and it would be limited to that. Today, anyone with internet access can make a YouTube video and publish it online, and they will share their view with literally the entire world. And the ulama are now competing with this, with not only other scholars, but also with lay people who have information, but not necessarily knowledge. And this poses a threat to the authority of the ulama. And that's why traditionalists would insist that the only correct way to understand Islam is through studying with a scholar. Another point here is that the ulama, a lot of them were against the printing of books for this very reason. Also, scribes were against it because they were losing their jobs to technology, the printing machine, right? It was actually a job. Some scholars, their actual job was just to copy books by hand because there was no printing press. And they lost their jobs to that. I don't know why this is moving. Okay. All right, so there's reservations to this, where we have traditionalists who have reservations against self-learning. And the student, here we have Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, who died in 1997, rahimahullah. We have his student, Muhammad Awama, who called the situation, the educational situation in the Muslim world in modern times, he called it al-fawda al-miya. It's educational chaos, where everyone has an opinion on everything. Everyone does their own, has their own interpretation of Islam. Everyone has all of these things to say, right? And he's obviously coming from that traditionalist perspective, where he believes the voice of the ulama is the only correct one. Then we have Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, who says this, and he died in 1997. So he's not speaking about social media yet. There's no social media at this time. He says the computer is musibat al-asr. It is the affliction of the time. And at that time, you probably only had like CDs or floppy disks with books on them, right? And he actually says, he says some people, they think if they read a fiqh book, they become a faqih. They read a law book, they become a lawyer. And if they read a hadith book, they become a muhaddith. So here he's differentiating between access to information and knowledge itself. Okay, so this is the context that this kind of debate is happening in, where the khilafah falls. There's a lot of changes in education. The ulama have lost their positions, and now they are competing with a lot of people who are both intellectual, not necessarily ulama in the traditionalist sense, but they are self-taught or learned, and they are also dealing with lay people who have access to knowledge. The next point, and this is the main point of tension, I think, that I highlight in the book, which is Islamic law between Salafis and traditionalists. So when it comes to Islamic law, we have the Quran and Sunnah as sources of law. And this is very important to understand, because a source of law is different than law itself. So the Quran does not actually, in most cases, does not actually spell out law. So the Quran does not have, for example, the arkan of salah are not spelled out in it. It requires some digging through, some analytical studies to kind of do that, to figure that out. The arkan of hajj, the arkan of wudu, all of this stuff requires some scholarship to go in and kind of study that. So the Quran and the Sunnah are sources of law. A source of law is different than law itself. Like in the American context, we have the Constitution. That is a source of law. We look at that and we say, this is where we draw law from, but it's not law itself, because that source of law is not always clear cut. And these, the approach of Salafis is usually that the Quran and Sunnah are laws themselves. So if you look at Salafi publications, not only of Albani, of many Salafis, you'll find a lot of quotation of Quran and Hadith and very little commentary. There's not a lot of them speaking. It's a lot of, okay, here's the topic and here's all the Hadith on it, and here are the ayat on it. And the reason for that is because they consider that these ayat and Quran, these ayat and Hadith, they speak for themselves, right? They are very clear and evident. The traditionalist perspective is that these ahadith and these ayat are not as clear as one may think of them or one may consider them. So the discussion comes up is what is a dalil? So a lot of times, if you look at these discussions in Islam, when it comes to the traditionalists and Salafis or anyone, there's this usage of this word dalil. And dalil is actually not proof. A lot of people think dalil is proof. A dalil is actually an indication, yadullu ala shay. It just indicates something. And there's different kinds of dalils. So a dalil by itself does not establish proof. And there are two kinds of dalils. There's qat'i and there's dhanni. And I'll give an example, I'll give an example from the Quran as well. But first, I just want to give a normal human example. Now, if you were to come to my house and you were to walk in and you see that my shoes are there, this is a piece of evidence that you can use to make a conclusion, come to a conclusion that I am at home, I am in the house. You use this one piece of evidence, but this piece of evidence by itself is insufficient. You cannot guarantee that I am in the house based on this one piece of evidence. It's likely, but there is a possibility that I am not there, right? I could have worn another pair of shoes. There's other things that I could have been, wore my slippers. It could have been anything. So what happens when a traditionalist builds a case, right? They actually build a case for an argument, but the result of that argument is not 100% sure. And I'll build on this example. So you come to my house, you see my shoes, that's one dalil that I am home. Then you see my keys are there, that's another dalil. Then you see my umbrellas there, my car is outside. All of these are dalils. Did you see me? Are you 100% sure that this is true, that I am at home? You are not, because you did not see me. So this is what we would call dalil dhanni. Or you can say all of these are dalil dhannis and they are taken to build a case. And this is the same thing that happens in courts today. Someone commits murder, unless there's a camera, the prosecutor actually brings in several pieces of evidence to build a case. We didn't see the murder with our eyes. He brings in the glove. He may have heard someone, there's a witness, maybe a scream here and there, and he takes all of these things and he builds a case. Is it absolutely 100% the truth? No, but it's what we would call ghalabatul dhann, most likely true. Now, qat'i is a different case. Qat'i is where you come to my house and you see me, I'm there. There's no interpretation. You don't need my shoes, you don't need the umbrella, you don't need anything else. That is 100% true because you've seen me. The Quran and the Sunnah, the dalils inside of them, most of them are actually dhanni. They are not, they're open for interpretation. I'll give an example of a qat'i dalil in the Quran, where the Quran says, "Az-zaniyatu waz-zani," the female fornicator and the male fornicator, فَجْلِدُوا كُلَّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا مِئَةَ جَلْدَةٍ. Each one of them is to get 100 lashes. The number 100 is clear. It's not 99, it's not 200, it's not 150. And the Quran mentions both of them, each of them. So it's not like he'll get 50, she'll get 50, it's each of them will get it. But what is a zani? Is it someone who just looks? Is it someone who flirts? That's defined by the Sunnah, but if that was not there, that is not as clear as the number 100. So the question comes down to this: is it possible to know the absolute truth in law? And from the traditionalist perspective, usually they would say no. So that's why they believe that the case that they built is correct, but they do not say this is 100% the absolute truth. That's why we have the statement of Imam Shafi'i, who says that my opinion is sawab, my opinion is correct, yahtamilu al-khata. There is the possibility that is incorrect. So Imam Shafi'i is saying, I built this case, I believe it to be true. There is a small possibility that this person is not home, but based on all of my evidence, he's home, right? And he says, my opponent is incorrect, but his opinion يحتمل الصواب, his opinion may be correct. So there's this acknowledgement that it's not as black and white as it appears. There's always this margin of error. It doesn't mean that the opinion is wrong. It just means that the opinion is not absolute truth. And here, this is where someone like Sheikh Albani, rahimahullah, he differs with traditionalists because his opinion is he doesn't believe it to be a dhanni, or he believes it to be absolute truth. There's no other opinion. There cannot be another understanding of this issue. And if we look at the works of Sheikh Albani, to my knowledge, I've studied the vast majority of them as to the best of my ability. I've never seen him change his fiqh opinion. I've seen him change hadith, his opinion on the hadith. I've seen that. I've never seen him change his fiqh opinion, where he said, I previously had this opinion and I've changed it to something else. And this is actually a very appealing, this conviction-driven approach to Islamic law is actually quite appealing to a lot of people. In the modern world, right, people want certainty. No one wants, like a lot of times people say, I don't want the madhab, I don't want the opinion of the scholar, I want the truth. Just tell me Quran and Sunnah, don't tell me this or that. Because people want, naturally they want to follow what they want, that direct connection with the scripture itself. So this brings us to the next question, which is, what makes an interpretation valid? So does this mean every interpretation is valid? That, anyone who has an interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah, is it valid? The traditionalist perspective would say no, not every interpretation is valid. The interpretation must follow a methodology. So the question many people ask is, what is the correct opinion? And oftentimes this is the wrong question to ask. The right question is usually, what methodology is this based on? How did you come to this conclusion? So from the traditionalist perspective, you have what's more important than the answer is the methodology. And what is a madhab to begin with? A madhab is actually this school of scholars or centuries of scholars who've used a similar methodology to approach law, to approach the Quran and Sunnah as law. So they would say, we have the Quran, we have the Sunnah, we have qiyas, we have ijma', and then they'll differ on other things, but they're consistently using the same methodology. When they do that, they're kind of, and you have centuries of scholars who are doing this, it gives authority to the school of thought because it is not the opinion of one person, but it's collective. Even the schools of thought themselves, you'll find the wording of, within the fiqh books, you rarely find someone saying this is the correct opinion. They say al-asahhu indana, the more correct opinion indana. Or they would say al-mu'tamad, the relied upon opinion. You rarely find them saying this is 100% absolute truth in law, unless they are speaking obviously of things that are well established, the usul of the deen, the main parts of the religion. So here I'm going to just share a quote by Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, who was a critic of Sheikh Albani, where he says, he's speaking of some hadith scholars, early hadith scholars. He says, if the likes of Yahya al-Qattan, Waki' bin Jarrah, Abd al-Razzaq, Yahya bin Ma'in, and their caliber did not perform ijtihad and fiqh. Now these are hadith scholars. So these are people who know hadith very well. But he says that they themselves did not perform ijtihad. So he says, how about the people today, how audacious they are in our time who perform ijtihad? And on top of that, they call the pious predecessors, Abu Hanifa, Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, Imam Malik, they call them ignorant with the least shame or modesty. God is our refuge from such deceit. So he sees here that having even these people who are great muhaddiths did not partake in ijtihad because they felt that that's not their area. But today what he sees is a lot of young people who are just reading some books or something else like that, and they are performing ijtihad. And this also happens sometimes, people not even using Arabic itself, just basing it on translation. Now, Salafis are generally against taqlid, while traditionalists insist on taqlid. I'm going to Salafis define taqlid as blind imitation, whereas traditionalists have a little bit more complicated definition, which I'll get to shortly. But the reality is that taqlid is a social reality. There are not mujtahids on every corner. There are not people everywhere. You know, it's not easy to find a mujtahid, someone who has studied Islam vastly, and it's not easy to find that person everywhere. So the reality is that people rely on experts, right? Even today, you'll see a lot of people, today you have this whole vaccine debate, right? You'll see a lot of people who say, I'm going to do my own research. But people, when they say that, what they actually mean is I'm going to read someone else's research, and then I will come to a conclusion. Because that person doesn't go into a lab themselves and do the research. A lot of people today, similarly, when it comes to the religious context, they're going to say, I'm going to research it myself. What does that mean? That means they are going to go online and read someone else's opinion. This is not research. This is kind of reading someone else's research and kind of just validating your own opinion. So the reality is that conducting this research of ijtihad is something that is not accessible to most people because it requires a lifetime of scholarship. So we have Sheikh Albani, rahimahullah, who has two different approaches. When you read his works, there's two different attitudes towards taqlid, and this can often lead to confusion. And I kind of try to clarify this in my book. So sometimes when people ask Sheikh Albani about taqlid, he says it's haram, or he says it is just based on necessity, just like pork. You can only eat pork when you absolutely have to, right? It's not something you should try to do. But then other times he says you must perform taqlid. So to clarify, Sheikh Albani absolutely did not believe that the lay person is equipped to understand text themselves. He never, when he was pressed, he never actually promoted this, and he's actually against it. Earlier on in his life, he had this anti-taqlid approach, and he carried it consistently through his life. But later on, I believe that he kind of toned down a bit. And in some cases, he actually says that the lay person must follow a scholar. Regardless of what he says, regardless of what you call it, the following a scholar you trust is necessary. So here, it's actually not that much different than traditionalists. They both say you must perform taqlid. However, here he differentiates himself from his critics. He says, we call it ittiba'. So we don't call it taqlid, we call it following. And we do this to differentiate between us and them, based on the fact that we leave a scholar if his mistake is clear. However, they blindly follow him without thinking. And this part is where traditionalists would consider it kind of problematic, because he's accusing them of following blindly without thinking when they would say we are following it based on our conviction of that this is correct. Another case, he says, "Taqlid la budda li kulli muslimin an yuqallid." He says every Muslim must perform taqlid. And he even says Salafis perform taqlid, but the difference between Salafis and non-Salafis is that Salafis follow both jurist and hadith scholars, whereas the traditionalists, they would follow only a faqih or only one scholar. And there's some responses to this that don't really have time to get into from his detractors. So again, he kind of says that Salafis don't limit themselves. They are not blindly following a particular person. Whereas traditionalists, they follow a particular scholar, and they, in his view, disregard all other scholars. In my book, I have a lot of quotes from scholars between Albani and his critics, and here I'll just share two. And they both view each other as sources of division. So Sheikh Albani, rahimahullah, I understand the context that he was born in, where he sees kind of the strict madhabism. Even in his time, sometimes the Hanafis would not pray behind the Shafi'is in his local mosque in Syria. They had different imams, or you go to the one masjid, they had different prayers. So a lot of people like to criticize Sheikh Albani for being anti-madhab or something, and it's true that he does have this anti-madhab rhetoric, but also understanding the context of which he grew up in, he kind of saw these things and it frustrated him. So he said the followers of the madhabs behave as though they belong to different religions. And he uses some examples that some of them are taken out of context historically, or he kind of nitpicks some of them and he kind of generalizes this onto everyone else. Here we have Muhammad Ramadan al-Buti, who is a Syrian traditionalist who wrote who is a critic of Albani. Him and Albani have a lot of back and forth. He also says that Salafis are a source of division as well, because they believe that only their opinion is correct. Every other opinion is incorrect. And what happens then, they go into a masjid or a mosque and they say everyone who has a different opinion is wrong. So if you are praying with your hands in a different position, they will criticize you. Or you are not raising your hands in prayer, or you're doing something else, they begin criticizing, and this causes division. So they both view each other as sources of division. And here's another quote where Sheikh Albani, this is kind of his indirect, implicit attack on people who follow a madhab. And he says that he says, as for others, it is well known that they follow many people other than the Prophet. And he's basically implying that people who follow Abu Hanifa or Imam Shafi or Imam Malik or any other scholar, that they are following someone else other than the Prophet. And this kind of contradicts what he said about taqlid, right? Where he said every Muslim must follow someone. Every Muslim must follow taqlid. So why does he say this? Actually, I don't think he actually believes this. I think it's more of a rhetorical strategy to discredit his opponents, right? His opponents are following a madhab, and he wants to make them appear as blind followers, as people who are not following the truth. So he says, look, those people, they follow Abu Hanifa and Imam Shafi'i. As for me, I follow the Prophet ﷺ directly. And we all know that that every single person who reads a text, there's this process of interpretation that takes place. Bhuti responds to this, and he says that no Muslim in their right mind follows a person because of who they are. They actually follow them because they believe that what they are saying is the teaching of God and his Prophet. And he says even the Prophet himself, Muslims don't follow him because of who he is as a human being. They follow him based on the fact that he's carrying the message of God, right? So he kind of pushes back on Albani on this point. So Sheikh Albani was actually careful not to attack the madhabs directly, but he kind of, he takes a jab here and there at them. He kind of argues that, and this is where there's some historical simplicity in his argument, where he says the madhabs are not historically valid because they didn't exist in the time of the Prophet. So he says in the time of the Prophet, you didn't find anyone who said I was Umari, or I was Bakari, I was Uthmani, or I was Alawi. They all just followed Quran and Sunnah. And actually, if one were to study the history of all Islamic sciences, they didn't develop in the time of the companions in this as they matured later on. And I'll give the example of Arabic grammar. The companions used Arabic grammar. They spoke in pure Arabic, but they did not have the rules of Arabic grammar. Arabic grammar developed later on. Later on, people came and they looked back at the Quran, and they looked at the time of Jahiliyyah. They looked at how the Sahaba used Arabic, and they built Arabic grammar based on that. The madhabs, they did not exist in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but they were actually built the same way. As time evolved, Imam Shafi'i and others, they actually looked back, just like someone who built grammar, they looked back at the Quran. How does the Quran use grammar? I'm going to establish grammatical rules. Imam Shafi'i did not establish Islamic law himself. He did not make these qawa'id or usul up. He actually looked back in the usage of the Sahaba. How did they interpret law? And he built these usul of fiqh. Okay. So here, again, I'm just going to share quickly for time's sake. I have just a few more things to share, and then I'll end. I just want to share a few quotes. Here he's Sheikh Albani. Again, there's these implications. So people say Sheikh Albani is not anti-madhab. He's against ta'assub al-madhabi, which these kind of statements kind of put that into question. Where he says, for example, you don't find anyone who gives fatwas in the Muslim world today according to the Quran and Sunnah, except very few people who become like ghuraba, strangers. He said instead, most of them rely on one of the four madhabs. As for the Sunnah, it has long been forgotten. So here there's the implication, the implicit implication that the madhabs are different than the Quran and Sunnah. And this is done in a lot of works. And actually, Sheikh Muhammad Awama, he actually criticizes the idea of calling something fiqh sunnah, the fiqh of the sunnah. Because when you say that, you're implying that the fiqh of Shafi'i or fiqh of Abu Hanifa or anyone else is something else. There's that implication there. And it's a rhetorical strategy used to kind of establish authority. And this is actually a very interesting quote. I always laughed when I read this. Sheikh Albani, he said, he was asked if about the Hanbalis or the Wahhabis. He says, those who are called Wahhabis, they are Hanbalis. As for me, I refuse to be Hanafi. Therefore, I will also refuse to be Hanbali, because when I affiliated myself with the Messenger of God, blessings and peace be upon him, it has sufficed me from all other affiliations. I worship God alone and I follow Muhammad alone. God has no partner in worship and Muhammad has no partner in following. Again, there's the implication there. So this is why Albani tends to have this anti-madhab rhetoric. So he's not only criticizing the opinions of other scholars, he's also this implicit accusation that they are not following the Prophet himself. These are just some other things. I don't think I have much time to go through them, but they're just some more quotes. Sheikh Albani actually wrote a book called Sifat Salatul Nabi, which is a very famous book. It's been translated into many languages. And he actually begins the book by saying that I wrote this book about Salah because most people, he says, there's no book out there that has done this in detail according to the authentic Sunnah. And this is a topic of Salah, which is addressed in great detail in Islamic law. And then he's presenting, a lot of his works are presented as according to the Quran and Sunnah, according to as-Sunnah al-Mutahhara. And this kind of rhetoric angered his critics because, number one, they didn't want to call them their own works according to Quran and Sunnah or something like that in many cases, because they understood that this is not Quran and Sunnah. My interpretation is not Quran and Sunnah. It's an attempt to understand it. It's an ijtihad. And the understanding of a text is different than the text itself. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the last point, which is hadith. The third area of debate between these scholars is hadith, and in particular weak hadith. Most traditionalists accept the use of weak hadith, and Sheikh Albani was against it. And just to categorize this, weak hadith are actually different categories. So there's some that are very weak, close to being fabricated, and there's some that are very close to being what is called hasan. Most traditionalists allow the limited use of weak hadith. They believe that these weak hadith still have value. And why is this important? Because traditionalists, when they teach or when they, some of even their fiqh rulings are based on weak hadith. Now, a weak hadith is a dhanni dalil. It's a dalil that is dhanni, right? Because it's not 100% established that the Prophet said this, but the probability of the Prophet saying it is less. It's not fabricated in the sense that he did not say it. There's still a probability that he did say it as well. So for some scholars, instead of resorting to ijtihad, they would rather resort to a saying that the Prophet might have said, even if the probability is low. They'd rather be safe with that than go to their own ijtihad. So Sheikh Albani actually, I forgot to mention this, but early on, when he was a student reading early on, he actually read a Manar journal, and he read an article written by Rashid Rida where he quotes Zainuddin al-Iraqi criticizing Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin for its usage of weak hadith and tasawwuf. This inspired and sparked Sheikh Albani, rahimahullah, to go on and study and learn his whole life. And actually all of Sheikh Albani's works started from that moment, and all of them can be looked at as an attempt to purify Islam from weak hadith and what he would consider incorrect opinions of fiqh or tasawwuf or aqidah. So all of his books are in this regard. So he actually combed through a lot of books, hadith books, fiqh books, history books, and he actually would kind of represent these books, republish them by either documenting that this hadith is weak or removing the hadith completely. So he completely rejects the use of weak hadith. And his logic is a little, it makes some sense in some regard, where he says, what is the purpose of the isnad system? What is the purpose of going through this whole method of documenting and authenticating hadith if at the end of the day you're just going to disregard it and follow whatever you want? If a hadith is weak, in his opinion, it should not be used. And he gives he has actually a hadith collection, al-hadith al-da'if, the weak hadith, وَأَثَرُهُ السَّيِّئ, and its negative impact on the Muslim community. And here he gives one example. When he was growing up, he lived in Syria. So he said a lot of the Albanians, they used to think that praying in the Umayyad mosque is equivalent to 70,000 salah. And he says there's no hadith in these 6 hadith books that have this. He says it's actually a hadith that is quoted by Ibn Abidin, the last major Hanafi jurist. And he says that hadith is ظُلُمَاتٌ بَعْضُهَا عَلَى بَعْضٍ. That isnad of that is just darkness upon darkness. It has no validity. But here you have, he gives an example of lay people kind of establishing law and virtues and whatnot based on a weak hadith. On the other hand, you have traditionalists who say, well, we kind of need these weak hadith, right? Here you have Ali Jum'ah, who says we need weak hadith. He responds to Sheikh Albani, and he says we need weak hadith in order to teach people. Weak hadith and stories, they are there for a reason, and he says we have the right to use them. And again, a weak hadith is not fabricated. It's just that the probability is less. So they still see some value in it. Sheikh Albani, on the other hand, he says that anything you want, any lesson you want to draw from these weak hadith, you can draw that same lesson from authentic hadith. So there's no need to resort to those weak hadith. Okay, so this is my last slide here. I want to just briefly highlight Sheikh Albani's impact on the field of hadith. Number one, when we think of history and how history changes, like we might balk at the context or the idea of one person changing the course of history, right? But it's very challenging to look at the field of hadith and not acknowledge that Sheikh Albani single-handedly changed the direction of hadith studies. Again, if you look at just any hadith book today, he's mentioned in there. And he did this in several ways, okay? Number one, he started a trend of reviewing and re-examining a hadith. Sheikh Albani, he taught in the University of Medina in the 1960s, and he actually went and he started, this was controversial, but he started re-authenticating hadith. And I actually interviewed Suhaib Hassan, who was a student there at the time, one of the last living students. This is 1967. He's one of the last living students who studied with Albani. And he says, at that time, the scholars, they considered the hadith to have been cooked, eaten, and digested. Khalas, it's done. And he said Albani came back and he started cooking all over again. And this obviously caused some controversy. But what that did was it kind of sparked this renewed interest in hadith. Even his critics, they went and they reviewed these hadith again, even if it was just to refute him. But he basically started this trend of hadith re-examination, which resulted in many books we have today. Another important contribution he has is the citation and documentation of hadith. And this is something even Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda complains about, where there are many Islamic books that are written, and this is, we're speaking like early 1900s, that they are written in a sloppy way, where there's no citation of a hadith. You'll have a hadith with no authentication or no citation or nothing there. And Sheikh Albani was one of the people who actually started this trend. Like, we may think of just a normal thing today, but if you look at a lot of books before, in the early 1900s to mid 1900s, a lot of them would have a hadith with no citation. They wouldn't tell you whether this is in Tirmidhi or something else. I have my own understanding of why this is the case, because when scholars cite a hadith in a book, they're writing the book to other scholars. They're not writing it for normal people in many cases. So there's no need to cite the hadith. That scholar is very well aware that this hadith is in Bukhari or Muslim or somewhere else. Another, and this is the final point, is that there's a lot of hadith that Sheikh Albani actually graded that are outside of these 6 books of hadith. So a lot of times he would go to other books like Tarikh ibn Asakir, and he would find a hadith that is there that is not found in any of the 6 books, and he would authenticate that hadith. And he's the first scholar in history to have done that. And again, one may ask, why is he the first to have done that? These books, again, were written, scholars communicating to each other. So there's no need for them. They didn't feel the need to cite for a scholar who can easily understand and do this himself. He can go and authenticate the hadith himself. So when a scholar is communicating with another scholar in a book, he doesn't need to say this hadith is here or authentic or weak. The other scholar can do that by him or her self. So Albani is in history one of the first people to do that. So ultimately, just to wrap it all up, what I sought to do in this book was, again, try to give the reader an understanding and an inside look into what's going on in these debates. There are almost 100 books written by Albani against his critics and his critics against him. And I try to show both sides of the issue, and they're both kind of going back and forth and jabbing at each other. And ultimately, they tend to balance each other out, right? Where you have sometimes this madhabism that tends to be a little bit too rigid, and then you have this Salafism that kind of pulls back this way, and it's just a back and forth. But ultimately, you know, I'm just trying to give the reader this understanding of how these different Muslim groups approach scripture. And inshallah, I will stop here. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to address them.